Thank you. And what a perfect segue into what I want to talk about today. The way that we need to think about working from home, which has become a very significant signifier of the radical changes brought about by the coronavirus and the measures to combat it. But what we often tend to do is talk about working from home and talk a lot less, as we have always talked a lot less, about working in the home. And what I wanted to do today was sort of explore some of these gender dimensions of how we work from home and the ways in which this working from home, though it is presented as a very important shift and with many empowering benefits, is also in some ways just more of the same and is very risky in terms of re-entrenching some of the gender inequalities that have always plagued women at work. I really like this picture on the front slide. I've always liked it because of its sanitized aesthetic. And I also like the implication of gender equality in the image. Everything's beautifully laid out, straight down the line, his computer, hers, they each have a phone and a headset, and they're both down there making tea and coffee. There are no children in this image, which is an important thing to note. It's also a very classed image. But what we need to keep in mind when we see these images, which are circulated widely in the press and in the other media, is that the experience is not the same and that it is in fact highly gendered. So for a start, when we look at an image like that, we have to keep in mind that the male figure in there is much more likely to be earning the bigger sum of money. We know from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency that the gender pay gap is alive and well in Australia, and our most recent figures put it at almost 14%. This gender pay gap, of course, is informed by a number of factors, not only things such as discrimination and bias in hiring and pay decision, but it's also informed by women's disproportionate share of unpaid caring and domestic work, and also the lack of workplace flexibility to accommodate this additional work. And what's interesting here is the way that those two elements intersect. So we have several data sources to keep reminding us that men and women's experience of working in the home, of domestic work, which is interestingly also devalued in much of the current rhetoric, so that when people are talking about working from home, they're very clearly talking about paid work and completely then undervaluing or hiding all the unpaid work that supports that, which of course has been a significant drive of feminists for a very long time to make it clear that these are both important forms of work. So the Household Income and Labour Dynamics HILDA survey in Australia makes us a number of important points for us in relationship to this. Even though our attitudes may well be changing to gender, not a great deal has actually changed in terms of who does what work at home. So domestic work we're talking about here in terms of unpaid work around childcare, around cleaning, and around providing emotional support to many family members and extending to relative care. So for HILDA suggests that currently men do about an hour more now than they did 14 years ago, but women do 3 full-time work weeks more than men a year. This is a substantial difference. The other sources, such as the Gender Equality Agency, point out that women in Australia spend 65% of their average working time on unpaid care work, while men spend only 36% of their working time on unpaid care work. For every hour that men put in, women put in 1 hour and 48 minutes. Now, it doesn't matter which resources you look at, it is clearly a big difference in terms of the amount of time spent providing that unpaid and desperately important work. Further, even though women's actual amount of housework time has declined since the 1960s, it has still increased around childcare time and paid work time, so that leading to then a result in which there is a significant gender gap in leisure time as well. One of the most important things to keep in mind, though, in terms of this imbalance, is that the arrival of children is a significant point of divergence. So once children are on the scene, women's work tends to increase. Now, many women then do reduce the amount of paid hours that they do, but their unpaid work goes up consistently. Later on, when they return to work, HILDA has shown us that they find that their load of housework barely changes, and they only do 6% less care work as they were doing when they were mums at home. So it begins this kind of trajectory. At the same time, as we have long known, when men become fathers, there are many benefits for them, and there is significant research to show that men, when they become fathers, actually find that their career prospects improve and that they acquire higher pay. And part of this is because fathers are viewed favourably by promoters, and we still have this idea of the importance of the breadwinner. And so that supporting men in their work has this roll-on function of supporting families and thus communities. So these are long-term imbalances. And what do they mean in the current situation when the number and range of people working from home has rapidly and extensively expanded, to the extent that some people are talking about the working from home revolution? So what is working from home? Well, firstly, we need to keep in mind here too that women have a long history of working from home in many different jobs as one form of flexibility. So, for example, we have seen the increasing growth around the Western world in particular of what is known as the mumpreneur. And this particular identity and practice is seen to be enabled by information communication technologies and other forms of connectivity that mean that mainly middle-class young women in the global West can then set out to resolve the tension then between unpaid and paid work and to try and see how they might make a go of it. Significantly, people claim that mumpreneurship, so this sort of working from home, is an attempt to balance income generation and, importantly, very clear middle-class conceptions of good mothering. And this is another dimension of the debate that emerges, I think, throughout our discussion of working from in the home. Others have noticed, and including some work that myself and Penny and Paula have undertaken, is that this kind of shift to this mumpreneur position also means that we have not so much a renegotiation of the gender division of labour and the gender order, but rather that it enables a kind of making of a virtue out of working around children and around this unpaid work in ways that in fact might re-traditionalise gender roles. So we have new kinds of arrangements, but at the same time, what we're seeing is a greater number and different kinds of people working from home. I think this image is very interesting. It appears on the ABC website with a heading titled "Parents Doing Their Best." I think it's pretty telling. Of course, we know now that when we look at this image of a parent doing his best, that he is in fact doing a lot less of the house care and he's doing a lot less of the childcare work. And that's something we must keep in mind, and I argue is not kept in mind at all. So if we look at other images then of working from home, we might see here things that many of us can relate to a little bit more than the picture that we began with. We can see here that women are working with children very much in their space. Again, the images do not necessarily signify housework. This continues to remain hidden, I think. But in this current situation, the important thing to remember is not only are women now continuing on the kinds of tensions that they had before, but they are likely to have been increased. So here we have concerns around the extra work that might be needed to be done at home, more unpaid labour, additional stresses, as Ross pointed to, in terms of maintaining family mental health and additional cleaning and greater complexities around undertaking everyday tasks, and of course being kept at home in ways that make family tensions possibly increase. While these images tell a more realistic story, at the same time, it's interesting how they are framed. So these two images come from a couple of different websites. Now, the one with a child in the lounge, you might think is someone talking about, wow, imagine trying to work in this situation. You're just in this kind of very complex space with many things going on. However, the article actually that uses this is about how Zoom and Netflix are doing very well in the current COVID situation. And there is a kind of indication here that these people, women and children, are the main consumers of Netflix, for example. The other image of the woman at her desk with her child leaning on her on the back of the chair appears in an article with the title, "While Everyone is Working from Home, Go Easy on Netflix." Now that everyone in the family is connected from home all day long, there are several personal, dental, digital hygiene tips to follow, and the caption is anything to get them off your back. So the point I'm trying to make here, of course, is that women's representations of working at home tend to focus on the kinds of mothering that they might do, and tends to continue to hide the labour that goes into social production and running a house. So I think in terms of the COVID-19 working from home pandemic itself, perhaps, we need to think about what are the gendered effects, particularly the long-term gendered effects, and we can link these directly back to the kinds of things that we've already seen happen to women when they have children and then cannot take up so much paid work. For example, not having paid work for women when they have children means that they have smaller superannuation funds, it interferes with their career development and so on. And similar things are at risk here in the COVID-19 situation. So even in terms of strategies which have been designed to take the pressure off of people, we need to think about the gendering of those strategies. So for example, some universities are putting public announcements around what's expected when academics work from home. They're very concerned about working 25 out of a 35-hour week. They're going to call that a full working week. If you have to do less hours, you need to take leave. What I find interesting about this then is who might be the people who, due to these additional unrecognised unpaid labour commitments, are then those who need to take that kind of leave, or those who are then only putting in 25 hours. Because of course, once COVID-19 starts to come together and we find some new way of moving forward, it will be largely women, I would argue, who've taken up these kinds of benefits and then who are further behind in their careers and further behind in their capacities to earn income, etc. So I think the main point I'd like to make here is that in many of our discussions about working from home, whether it includes, you know, the overarching capitalist anxiety around productivity at home, are people working, are they watching Netflix, are women doing the right thing in terms of bringing up their children with digital hygiene, the discussion is very much on those terms around productivity, and it very much leaves the elephant in the room, which is who is what. So in that sense, who is doing the work at home? Is it women? Is it men? And should we not be having discussions ourselves in our homes, workplaces and public spaces about who is doing what work in the home? And at the same time, we can then try to resist the homogenising of the experience and the domination of very particular classed views of what working in the home might look like. Thank you.